Just because someone calls something a meta-analysis, it doesn't mean it is one. In this video, you will learn how to tell the difference between a real meta-analysis and a fake meta-analysis. Hello and welcome to Back to the Science. I'm Dr. Susan Oliver and I'm a scientist, and back there is my assistant, Julie Oliver. A number of people, including some people who have their own very popular YouTube channels, have promoted the Ivmmeta website and its claims of 67 studies that prove that ivermectin works. It professes to be a living meta-analysis, but ignores the rules about how a meta-analysis should be performed. In this video, we will be going through why it actually isn't a meta-analysis. But first, let's go back to the science and look at what is a meta-analysis and how they should be performed. A meta-analysis is a statistical method for combining the results of multiple studies to provide a summary of the data on a specific outcome. Importantly, a meta-analysis isn't done in isolation. It is part of what is known as a systematic review, and it involves a number of important steps. There are two key standards that define the steps involved in undertaking a systematic review. PRISM, which stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses, and the Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews of Interventions. All properly performed meta-analyses follow one or both of these standards. So there are actually 27 steps involved in performing a systematic review and meta-analysis. But don't panic, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will just briefly take you through some of the most important steps. Once you've searched and found all the studies about the intervention that you're interested in, the next step is to screen the studies to see if they are suitable for inclusion in the meta-analysis or not. Generally, the first step is to remove everything that isn't a randomized controlled trial, which is the only type of clinical trial that is able to determine if our treatment is effective. What happens in a randomized controlled trial is people are randomly assigned to one of two groups. And this randomization step is critical because without it, you don't know whether your two groups have differences that will affect their outcome. One group is given the treatment and the other group is given a tablet that looks identical to the treatment but doesn't actually contain any medication, otherwise known as a placebo. You then compare the results of the two groups and see if there is any difference. You also need to remove any studies where the drug you are interested in is combined with another drug or therapy, because you won't be able to separate the effects of the drugs. And you also need to remove studies where there is no placebo or standard of care arm, because you may just be seeing the side effects of an inappropriate treatment as opposed to a benefit of the drug you are testing. It is okay, though, to use a proven treatment as a comparator arm. So once you've done the initial screening, you then look more closely at the studies that are left and perform a risk of bias assessment, or ROB for short. The ROB assessment is the most colourful part of performing a meta-analysis. Every study is assessed for bias based on a number of parameters, and the risk of bias for each parameter is assessed as low, which gets a green tick, high, which gets a red cross, or some concerns, which gets a yellow squiggly line thing. Amongst the things that are assessed are whether the two groups are actually similar, whether the patients and doctors are blinded to what treatment they are getting so that there isn't a placebo effect, whether any data points are missing from the results, and whether the outcomes are measured appropriately. For instance, if an outcome was whether someone caught COVID, you would need to confirm this with a PCR test and not just rely on symptoms. So we are nearly at the actual meta-analysis. But first you have to determine if a meta-analysis is actually appropriate. If the designs of the studies are too different or the outcomes measured are not sufficiently similar, it is not possible to do a meta-analysis because the statistical technique that is used wouldn't be valid in these cases. This figure is a key output of a meta-analysis, and it is what is known as a forest plot. This isn't from a real meta-analysis. I've just made it up using studies named after various dogs I have had. The forest plot shows the results of each study analysed, as well as the overall result when the studies are combined. And the combined results are shown as a diamond. If a result is to the left of the vertical line, it means the intervention, in this case having a dog, has a benefit. And if it is to the right, it means that not having a dog is better. If the result crosses the line, it means we don't know whether or not having a dog is better. As the result is completely to the left of the line, it means that having a doc is beneficial, but I'm sure you all knew that anyway. One thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the I-squared number. This is a metric used to assess the heterogeneity of the studies and whether they are actually suitable for pooling together in a meta-analysis. If the value is too high, it means you need to find a way to split the meta-analysis into smaller groups of similar studies that aren't so heterogeneous. Otherwise, you are just combining apples and oranges and ending up with a nice fruit salad, but a rubbish meta-analysis. Generally, an I-squared of less than 20% means that there is little variability between the studies and they are suitable for combining into a meta-analysis. And if the I-squared is over 50, then that means there is substantial variability between the studies and they shouldn't be combined. So that's some of the key steps in performing a meta-analysis. Now we're going to look at the Ivmmeta website and have a look at what they do instead. Now, the people behind the Ivmmeta website are anonymous, so we don't really know anything about them. They use American spelling, so that narrows it down a tiny bit, but it's safe to say they have no experience in performing meta-analyses. The software required to produce a forest plot is available for free, so anyone can use it without actually knowing what they are doing. When this happens, of course, it is a case of garbage in, garbage out. So this is a website, and if you don't look too closely, it looks pretty impressive. It's full of beautiful graphics and lots of forest plots. Of course, the beautiful graphics don't include the most important beautiful graphics, which are the risk of bias assessments for the studies, and every forest plot is invalid. The website is simply beautifully designed garbage. So let's look at the first forest plot. It's meant to be all the early treatment studies which they've defined as beginning treatment within 5 days. A lot of the studies don't really have enough information provided to classify them as early or late treatment based on this criteria, but that's a rather minor point compared with the huge problems with this forest plot. The first thing that I'd like to draw your attention to is the I-squared value, which is over 60%. As we discussed in the previous section, a value over 50% means that the studies are too heterogeneous to be combined in a meta-analysis. So this forest plot should never have been published. Looking more closely, we can see that a lot of the studies aren't even randomized controlled trials. So we'll just put a red line through all of them. Okay, so that's removed 13 of them. Next, we'll put a blue line through the studies where ivermectin was used in combination with another treatment because they proved nothing about ivermectin. So that's another 2 studies gone. Finally, we need to remove the studies that are at a high risk of bias. Another 2 studies gone. And just so you know, this is not just me saying these studies are at a high risk of bias. They've been classified as high risk of bias in reputable ivermectin meta-analyses. So we've now removed 17 studies that have no business being in any meta-analysis. So let's have a look at what is left. If you have a look at the details, you see that the authors of the Ivmmeta website have picked different outcomes and combined them all into the same forest plot. They claim they have chosen the most serious outcome from each study and used those values for the meta-analysis. Well, that's very creative, but it's totally invalid. You cannot combine different outcomes in one forest plot. I was just flabbergasted when I saw it. And even if this was a valid technique, their selection of outcomes seems a little strange. In the case of Ivmmeta, they have ignored the duration of hospitalisation data where there was no difference between ivermectin and placebo. They have ignored cough symptoms where only 40% of those on placebo still had a cough after 7 days, compared with 6% for those taking the ivermectin. Instead, they chose fever, where ivermectin just happened to perform marginally better. Well, that's all a bit disappointing. The forest plot is telling us absolutely nothing. Perhaps we can save the day and just look at the studies that are left that had mortality as an outcome. I have prepared this forest plot using a software package called RevMan5, which is available for free from Cochrane. As you can see, the diamond crosses the line, which means the current evidence doesn't show that ivermectin has any benefit in terms of mortality. You can also see that the I-squared value is 0, which means that there is no heterogeneity in the studies. So that was the early treatment studies. Let's now very briefly look at the prophylaxis and the late treatment studies. In the case of the prophylaxis studies, once we remove the non-randomized studies, the studies where ivermectin was combined with other interventions, and the studies with a high risk of bias, there are actually no studies left. And it really is a stretch to even call everything on this forest plot a study. One of the entries is actually the results of an ivermectin opinion survey. With the late treatment studies, we've removed 15, but there are still a few left that have mortality as an outcome. So we'll make a forest plot from them. Now, in addition to the studies from Ivmmeta, I have included an extra study which, for some inexplicable reason, wasn't included in the original forest plot. The study is known as either Gallen or Fonseca, depending on whether you are naming it after the first or last author. Now, looking at the forest plot, again, the diamond crosses the line. So there is no overall benefit seen for ivermectin. And here I've combined the early treatment and late treatment studies into one forest plot. Even when combined, the diamond still crosses the line. You can also see there is no difference in outcomes whether ivermectin is given early or late. And this is further evidenced by the I-squared value, which is again 0. Now, there are still a few more trials underway for ivermectin, so we could get the diamond away from the line. But based on the current evidence, we can't say whether ivermectin has a benefit or whether it causes harm. If it does have a benefit based on the data so far, it's likely to be a fairly modest benefit. Of course, the Ivmmeta website contains many more forest plots. I won't bore you by analysing any more of them, but every one of them is invalid. There is one more thing I would like to draw your attention to, though. The authors of Ivmmeta include this figure, which they use to add legitimacy to their website by claiming their results are consistent with other meta-analyses. We can put down the mistakes in the forest plots to general incompetence, but this figure is deliberately misleading. Firstly, they have cherry-picked the meta-analyses. These 3 peer-reviewed meta-analyses have been left out of the figure. And if you're wondering what these 3 studies have in common, they all found that ivermectin didn't show a benefit. Secondly, all the meta-analyses include studies that have been shown to be fraudulent, which completely invalidates the meta-analyses. Additionally, the Corrie and Laurie's so-called meta-analyses contain non-randomized trials. And the Laurie and Bryant meta-analyses share the same author, so are hardly independent. Finally, the data included for the WHO meta-analysis is simply wrong. This is a forest plot from the WHO document. They have actually split the studies into those with a high risk of bias and those with a low risk of bias. And they found that if you look just at those studies with a low risk of bias, there is no benefit for ivermectin. And also, since this meta-analysis was done, the naive study, which they classified as high risk of bias, has actually been shown to be fraudulent. Importantly, though, the overall risk ratio they found was 0.36, whereas the Ivmmeta website is claiming it was 0.19. Now, I could go on, but I'm sure you've heard enough. But if you'd like to learn more about how to do a proper meta-analysis, I will provide some links in the video's description. And please remember, this video is about the science, but you shouldn't take it as medical advice. For that, you should speak to your medical practitioner. So thank you for listening. And if you'd like to see more videos about the science in the future, please hit the subscribe button.